Warning! The subject of this video has been rated to be restricted to ages 18 and over on account of frequent violence, strong language, drug use, frequent nudity, and strong sexual violence. And now the disclaimer's out of the way. Hey there, welcome to East and West. Let's talk about hard Romanticker. Premiering at the Busan Film Festival in 2011, this is an exploitation film that centers around being a rather unsettling look at the criminal underground in South Japan, particularly involving the Zainichi Koreans that live within that district. Based on a semi-autobiographical novel by Soo Young-gu, who also happens to be the film's director, the film follows a fictionalized version of himself over the course of about a week, as he almost single-handedly starts a war between two rivaling gangs, mostly by having both sides fighting over who has the right to kill him. Gu in this film is portrayed by actor Shota Matsuda, and despite the fact that most of the films he's known for are a far cry from this type of movie, he has done hardcore roles before, and he does a very decent job here. By which I mean the actor does a great job for what he has, because the character, despite from the fact that it is 100% meant to be based off the director, is really not that good. Now, I understand the intent here. They're trying to make it so that even though this clearly isn't a good guy, he's still better than everybody else around him. Which really isn't that difficult because every other character in this film is an absolutely horrible, horrible, horrible person. The standout one being this particular cop who is just straight up insane. But the problem is that there's no real consistency to his characterization. Like, at times he'll do something that sort of hints at that might be somewhat of a moral compass, except 10 minutes later, he's doing the exact type of thing he was against 2 scenes ago. If anything, the main theme of his character seems to be the idea of there are lines that you cross, and there are lines that you don't cross, until you end up moving those lines so that you're allowed to cross them. Now, possibly this might have been done so that he comes off as just selfish. So it's a case of, you're not allowed to do these horrible things, but I am because, well, I'm me. Which is a fair enough personality trait, and it makes it so that, even though he's very clearly different, he still fits into this realm of just completely terrible people. But despite having about 90% of the people in this film fall under that exact characterization, there's a very strong comedic edge to this film. Most of the humor being based around, can we make it so that this situation goes just far enough to actually be funny? But this isn't like a case of completely over-the-top, full-blown exploitation. It's trying to be a lot more subtle than that. So what usually results is that the scenario of these characters ends up being slightly more outlandish than what you would normally expect for this type of film. The opening to the film, for example, involves having a skinny blonde guy jumping across rooftops, mostly naked, to the tune of upbeat jazz. And then about 10 minutes later, you have that exact same character trying to escape from people running after him while riding a moped. This is not something that exactly screams hardcore gangster film to me. I think the main idea that links a lot of this film together is the concept of turning a blind eye. Whether it be the principal characters, or in one case literally random people in the background, most of the drama and a lot of the humor in this film stems from having things very obviously happening, and having people very obviously ignoring things happening. And they're lucky that this works as often as it does, because whenever the film tries to take a more traditional approach to humor or drama, it doesn't really pan out. It's one of the drawbacks that comes from having most of the characters in the film be irredeemable jerks. Now, in terms of the cinematography, it's actually pretty decent. In fact, this is one of those films that manages to use the shaky cam handheld effect, and actually use it well without being nauseating. Mostly because I'm fairly certain this is quite literally being filmed on a handheld camera. But there's one particular style choice that I want to discuss, and that's the fact that this film uses a lot of long-take, locked-on shots, where the camera just completely sticks on a scene, unmoving, for an extended period of time. I bring this up because while at the start it's definitely noticeable that they're using this technique, and it actually really improves some of the scenes by enunciating the fly-on-the-wall aspect to it, by the time the end of the film comes around, it is becoming ridiculously overused. And while it is very impressive that the actors can pull off a lot of these scenes in one take, it ends up making a lot of these shots look very, very empty, particularly when the subjects are small and are just continuously moving back and forth across the frame. And easily the most bizarre usage of this technique in the film is this particular scene, where it's just simply this shot of a backstreet alley while having Gu walk down away from the camera. This shot is almost a full minute long, and while this type of technique is actually usually good for this shot, it both A, requires the camera not to be at a 40-degree Dutch angle, and 2, not make the first 25 seconds of the scene have the main character not even be in frame. That's literally it for 20 seconds. Just that sound. Oh good, we've finally got something happening. But like I said though, this isn't actually a bad technique, and the film actually pulls great use out of it most of the time. But as the film goes on, it starts getting used a lot more in cases where it really shouldn't be, which makes it a lot more noticeable, and therefore a lot more distracting. But easily the weakest part of this film is to do with the story and the pacing. Now, because this is a film that is just meant to be making you uncomfortable, the story isn't meant to be much of a main focus. And while there is a consistent plot line, the pacing of it is deliberately erratic. In fact, there's an entire half hour where the story basically stops dead in its tracks when the main character runs off to be a concierge. Yeah, that's a thing that happens. But it's not all just empty space though, there's actually a substantial number of side plots in this film. However, they're all basically completely independent of the main story, and are simply there just to make the characters seem even more despicable than they already do. In fact, there's actually a number of characters whose entire existence in this film is solely limited to these side stories. Although, to be honest, calling them stories is giving them a little bit too much credit, as they're just sort of happen. There's not really much else going on, they're just events that occur while this film takes place. And this would be fine if the film was doing its job by keeping you emotionally triggered during these scenes, but rather counterproductively, most of the exploitative elements of this film are contained to within the main storyline. There's a grand total of maybe 2 that aren't. Everything else is tied to advancing the main plotline, but that only happens every 5 minutes or so. Because of this fact, and because a lot of these side plots are also contained to within a single room, so it's not visually interesting, the film can end up feeling like it's treading water rather frequently. And the very end of this film is definitely like this. After a full-on confrontation between Goo and what seems like every other character we've ever seen in this film, which is easily the best scene in the movie, by the way, the final shot of the film moves at an absolutely glacially slow pace until the actual end of the movie. There's nothing actually happening in this scene, it's just meant to be indicative of the fact that nothing has changed since the start of the film, but really, you only need about 15 seconds to establish that, and this shot takes almost 2 minutes. In fact, it actually moves so slowly that the music to the opening credits starts a full 30 seconds before the credits themselves actually start. Because clearly this last shot was absolutely necessary to be in the film. Now the last thing I need to mention is in regards to the sexual aspects of the film. As mentioned in the disclaimer at the start, not only is there a very high amount of gratuitous nudity in this, but most of the women in this film simply exist to be assaulted in one aspect or another. This happens a lot. As in, a lot. Possibly too much. And I perfectly understand that a lot of these scenes are simply based around the film's exploitative nature. Perfectly understandable, that's exactly what they're going for. But the issue I have is that in a number of these cases, the gratuity for gratuity's sake just ends up being much more distracting than it is shocking, simply because of how completely out of place it is. I mean, seriously, director, you're already showing us a barely legal girl covered in a pool of her own blood after being hit by a truck, and you still decide to have her be topless. Classy. All in all, if you're the type of person that likes exploitation films, this one's a little more tamer than usual, but I still recommend it's worth a look. If you're the type of person that's completely abhorred by any of the things I've mentioned, then stay as far away as you can. But for everybody else, it's just alright. It has some good moments, and there's nothing in it that's completely unwatchably bad, but you're not missing out on much if you don't go and seek this out. I give this film 5 iron bars and 6 pairs of boxes.
Hard Romanticker.
So that was my review of Hard Romanticker. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for watching. Till next time.